I never thought I'd have to choose between staying invisible and watching my son grow up afraid of the man living next door. For 4 months, my entire life was built around one goal: making sure nobody ever found out who I really was. Then a lifted pickup truck rolled into my neighborhood, and everything I'd buried came roaring back to the surface. Put the gloves on, tough guy brother-in-law, or should I snap your arm and send you to the hospital right in front of that little brat kid of yours? Grant sneered those words and threw a pair of MMA gloves straight at my boots. Behind him, his father let out a booming laugh that shook the humid air. Teach this washed-up soldier a lesson, son. Show him that in this neighborhood my money is the law. I stood perfectly still on the grass, looking at the family that was trying to crush my son and me for sport. Overseas, strangers in uniform had taken bullets to keep me alive. Here, my own blood was driving knives straight into my back. None of them understood that cornering a special operations officer wasn't a display of power. It was a death sentence for their little empire, and they'd just signed it themselves. Before I tell you what happened, take a second to like and subscribe if this story means something to you, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I spent a decade in war zones. Fallujah, Kandahar. Forward operating bases so deep in hostile territory that the resupply helicopters wouldn't even land. They'd just kick the pallets out the back and bank hard before ground fire opened up. Places where the air tasted like scorched metal and diesel, and the only promise anyone actually kept was the promise to bring you home breathing. I earned my rank the hard way. One deployment, one close call, one scar at a time. Major United States Army Special Operations, Lead Security Assessor. My job was to see a threat before it materialized, to read people the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, and to shut problems down with the least amount of noise possible. I was good at it. The men and women who watched me work under fire kept requesting me for the next rotation, and that told me everything I needed to know about whether I was good at my job. But when I came home to the North Carolina suburbs outside Fort Liberty, I locked every bit of that away. My medals went into a fireproof safe in the basement, stacked under a folded flag and a commendation letter signed by a 2-star general. My service record disappeared behind a classification wall so thick that a federal judge would need 3 separate signatures just to look at it. I told everyone, including my own sister, that I pushed paperwork at the Department of Defense. Administrative support. A GS7 pay grade. A nothing job for nobody. That was the plan. I stripped every trace of who I actually was because I had one mission left that mattered more than any deployment ever had. Raising my son Ethan somewhere quiet. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Black coffee in a chipped mug with a faded Army logo, leaning against the counter, watching Ethan through the kitchen window. He'd be out in the yard by 7, chasing the neighbor's cat through the azaleas or building something out of sticks near the back fence. I scanned the tree line out of habit, fence posts, blind spots by the garage, sightlines from the road. I counted how long it took a car to pass from one end of the street to the other. Old instincts. The kind you never fully switch off, even in a cul-de-sac where the biggest threat is supposed to be a raccoon in the trash cans. That piece lasted exactly 4 months. The first sign was a convoy of moving trucks rolling down our quiet street at 6 in the morning, followed by a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon with chrome trim and tinted windows that caught the light like a warning flare. Richard Sloan had bought the estate right next to my modest 3-bedroom. The property sat on the other side of a low wooden fence I'd built myself the previous summer, sinking every post by hand. Within 48 hours, that fence became the border between 2 completely different worlds. I watched from behind my kitchen curtain as they unloaded their lives onto the driveway. Italian leather sectionals wrapped in plastic. A massive flat screen carried sideways by two guys in matching polos who looked hired specifically to seem impressed by everything they touched. Boxes stacked with designer logos. A marble dining table so heavy it took 4 men and a dolly to get through the front door. Richard supervised the whole thing from the center of his driveway, barking into a gold-cased phone while landscapers ripped out the old rose bushes to make room for ornamental palms that had no business growing in North Carolina soil. Richard Sloan, a logistics tycoon. He'd made his fortune in freight transport, buying up small trucking companies during the recession and merging them into a single brand, Sloan Global Transport. The kind of man who confused owning expensive things with being important, who measured every person he met against the number in his bank account and found them all lacking. His son Grant jumped out of a lifted black pickup and immediately started hauling gym equipment into the garage. Grant was married to my sister Rebecca. She'd married into the Sloan family 2 years earlier, trading our last name for Richard's money and a lifestyle she could never have built herself. That marriage was exactly why this particular tycoon had decided to buy the estate right next to my fence. And that marriage was about to bring the deepest betrayal of my life to move in right next door. Grant was 24. 230 pounds of steroid-inflated muscle stuffed into a tank top 2 sizes too small. His traps were so swollen they nearly touched his earlobes, and his face carried that permanent bloated redness that comes from years of chemical shortcuts. He moved like a man who'd never once been told no, never been corrected, never had to consider that his body wasn't a legitimate argument in every conversation. Within the first hour, he chained a heavy bag to a steel post directly on our shared property line, close enough that every impact sent vibrations through the wood and into my kitchen wall. I felt each thud in my collarbone. I sipped my coffee and watched him through the glass, cataloging everything without meaning to. Guard dropped below his chin every third punch. Weight planted on his heels instead of the balls of his feet. Centerline wide open every time he threw a hook. A man trained to look dangerous in a mirror, not trained to survive against someone who ended threats in confined spaces with no light and no warning. Filed and stored. Richard drove his G-Wagon slowly past my property twice that first week, both times reducing to a deliberate crawl at my driveway, letting the engine idle so its aggressive rumble would announce him. His eyes swept my 10-year-old SUV, my unpainted porch railing I kept meaning to sand, Ethan's bike leaning against the steps with a playing card clipped to the spokes. He looked at my house the way a man looks at a stain on a new suit. He wanted me to see him looking. I noted it. I said nothing. My sister Rebecca showed up on a Thursday afternoon. She lived next door now in Richard's estate, sharing the master bedroom with Grant. She didn't call ahead. She walked through my front door like the world existed for her convenience and dropped her designer handbag onto my kitchen table like she was planting a flag. She spent 20 minutes talking about the master bathroom renovation Richard was funding. Italian marble heated floors with programmable zones. A soaking tub imported from outside Milan that cost more than my SUV was worth on a good day. She described every detail like she'd rehearsed it in the car, making sure each sentence landed like a small, polished grenade. While she talked, her eyes drifted across my laminate countertops, my thrift store curtains, my refrigerator covered in Ethan's crayon drawings held up by mismatched gas station magnets. She inventoried the whole kitchen. Then she picked up the coffee mug I'd poured her without being asked and sighed. You know, Damien, you could have so much more if you tried a little harder. That government salary isn't doing you any favors. She tapped her nails on the ceramic. 3 new rings, all gifts from the Sloan side, 1 diamond cluster throwing tiny rainbows across my white ceiling. I bit the inside of my cheek. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Heart rate steady. I didn't engage. I turned to the sink and started washing dishes, letting her insults hang in the quiet kitchen until she got bored and left, trailing perfume that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. The dishes clinked under the running water. Ethan's laughter drifted in through the open window. I dried my hands and stood there listening to the heavy bag thudding on the other side of the fence, each impact sending a small tremor through the wood. Grant didn't limit his territory to his own property. Within 2 weeks, I watched from my porch as he forced an elderly delivery driver off the sidewalk into wet grass just so he wouldn't have to adjust his path. He made the neighborhood kids ride into the street because he decided the sidewalk in front of the Sloan estate belonged to him. He left his sparring gear scattered across the curb, blocking the storm drain, daring anyone to move it. One afternoon, he kicked Walter Higgins's garden hose so hard the nozzle cracked against the curb. Walter, 70 years old with a bad knee, just stood on his lawn and watched. Nobody on the block said a word. Grant was spreading through the neighborhood like a tumor, and nobody had the nerve to cut him out. I stood at the window drying a glass, tracking his movements the way I used to track hostile patrols from a rooftop outside Jalalabad. Time of day routes targets. Filed away. On a hot afternoon in July, the kind where the asphalt shimmers and the cicadas scream loud enough to feel in your teeth, Ethan was outside washing my SUV. Hose in one hand, sponge in the other, radio playing low through the open window, humming along, totally absorbed in scrubbing a tire rim. The driveway smelled like soap and warm asphalt and cut grass. Grant came lumbering across the property line, shirtless, sweating, his neck veins swollen from whatever he'd been injecting that week. He walked straight to my SUV without a word, without even glancing at the 12-year-old standing right there, and shoved his arm through the open window. He grabbed the radio knob and twisted it so hard the whole plastic assembly cracked off the dash. The snap was sharp, like a small bone breaking. He dropped the piece onto the wet asphalt and growled at my son. "Garbage music. Turn it down next time." Ethan shrank back against the car door. The sponge slapped onto the wet concrete. His eyes went wide, his chin trembling. Too scared to scream, too frozen to run, too young to understand why a grown man would destroy something for no reason and then blame him for it. He just stood there, soap suds sliding down his forearms, staring up at a man 3 times his size who'd shattered his safe afternoon because he could. I was inside, 6 paces from the back door. I heard the crack. I saw his face through the window. My threat assessment went from green to red in under a second. I set down the glass I was drying and walked down the driveway. Hands loose at my sides. Weight forward onto the balls of my feet. Shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. Spine straight. My body shifted into a combat posture so subtle it would look like a casual walk to anyone who'd never been trained to spot the difference between a man walking and a weapon moving toward its target. I stopped 4 feet from Grant. Close enough to act, far enough to read him. I locked my eyes on the bridge of his nose, the spot where peripheral vision collapses. "Grant, you just crossed a line. Don't ever touch my property or threaten my son again." My voice came out flat. No heat, no negotiation. The same voice I used to deliver briefings where the wrong word got people killed. Grant snorted, puffed his chest out, using his size to loom over me by 8 inches and 100 pounds. He smelled like sour sweat and cheap body spray. "What are you gonna do about it?" "Sue me. You're just some washed-up guy living off a pathetic government paycheck." "Watch yourself," he smirked and swaggered back toward his property, certain his size made him untouchable because it always had before. I didn't chase him. I'd given him a door to walk through. That's protocol, you always give them an exit before you remove every door. I pulled Ethan into my arms and held him until the trembling stopped, his wet hair soaking my shirt, his small hands gripping my collar. Over his shoulder, I watched Grant disappear behind the fence, tossing the broken radio knob in the air and catching it like a trophy. I pressed my lips to the top of Ethan's head and kept my eyes on the fence. Grant had just placed himself on my active target list. August came in hot and loud. Richard threw a massive backyard party to celebrate Grant winning a cheap plastic trophy at some local semi-contact tournament, 8 fighters, half of them teenagers, and Grant had won his semi-final by forfeit when his opponent pulled a hamstring warming up. Didn't matter. The trophy had his name on a little plaque, and that was enough for Richard to rent a sound system loud enough to rattle every window on the block. On my side of the fence, Ethan had 3 friends over for a study group. 4 kids with textbooks and highlighters spread across the picnic table, working through summer reading. Quiet, focused, doing exactly what 12-year-olds are supposed to do on a summer afternoon. Grant spotted them through a gap in the fence. Found his perfect audience. He dragged his sparring gear to the property line and started throwing aggressive shadow strikes, grunting with every swing, making sure they heard every exhale. He threw spinning kicks that sliced through the air above the fence, snapping through the top branches of my lilac bushes, the ones I'd planted the year Ethan was born, the ones that bloomed purple every spring. Each broken branch hit the grass with a wet crack. Between kicks, he threw long looks at the kids, flexed, held the pose, waiting to see if they were watching. My phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. 3 words. Dad, he's scaring us. I stepped outside, walked to the fence at the same unhurried pace I used in hostile environments, where speed meant panic and panic meant mistakes. Take your circus somewhere else, Grant. You're bothering the kids, quiet, but the edge was exposed. His ego detonated. Getting corrected in front of 4 teenagers was more than his fragile self-image could process. His face went from red to nearly purple. He crossed the property line in 3 heavy steps, close enough I could smell the stale protein shake on his breath, grabbed a fistful of my shirt collar and yanked me hard enough to lift my heels off the ground. You dare give me orders? I could snap your neck right now, he roared, spit hitting my chin. Muscle memory took over before conscious thought could. I pivoted my hips to kill his forward momentum, my hand locked around his wrist and rotated it outward, my thumb driving into the nerve cluster on the inside of his forearm while I snapped his elbow past its natural extension. A textbook disruption taught in advanced combatives, designed to drop a bigger man without bruises, without breaking bones, without leaving evidence. Grant dropped into the grass like his legs had been unplugged. His mouth ripped open but nothing human came out, a strangled, airless wheeze. His arm spasmed, fingers curling involuntarily. I released instantly, stepped back 2 full steps and put on a look of wide-eyed clumsy shock. Oh my God, careful, Grant. Did you trip on a tree root? I called it loud enough for the kids at the table to hear, loud enough for the party on the other side of the fence, because I'd already positioned myself to block every angle. It looked exactly like he'd charged forward and face-planted all on his own. The kids glanced over, confused, giggled, and went back to their textbooks. Grant crawled away, arm curled against his ribs, face purple with humiliation clear to the tips of his ears, vanishing behind the ornamental palms. An hour later, my front door shook under heavy fists. I already knew who it was. Richard filled the doorway, face the color of raw beef, jaw grinding. Beside him stood Grant, cradling his arm, lip pushed out in a pout. And behind both of them, arms crossed, face completely detached, stood my sister Rebecca. Not beside me. Behind them. You dare put your hands on my son Damien, Richard screamed, spit hitting the door frame. I held my position in the doorway. Loose but rooted. Check your own security cameras. Grant attacked me first. I stepped back. He tripped on his own. Richard wasn't interested in facts. He stepped closer, jabbing his cigar-stained finger inches from my face. Listen to me, you pathetic soldier. I have money and power in this neighborhood. Keep making trouble for my son and your sister, and I'll sue you into the ground. I'll take this house and let Grant break your face. I let it land. Then I looked past him, past Grant, straight at Rebecca. I waited. I stood there remembering us cutting paper snowflakes on the living room floor as kids, remembering her small hand squeezing mine at the bus stop, remembering her sneaking into my bed during thunderstorms, whispering she wasn't scared, she just wanted to make sure I wasn't. I waited for that connection to mean something. Anything. Rebecca rolled her eyes and sighed, rehearsed as ever. Stop causing drama, Damien. You're just jealous my husband and I are richer than you. Something in my chest turned to ash. Not the hot ash of anger. The cold, gray kind you find in a fireplace 3 days after the fire's gone out. Nothing left to save. My sister had just cautioned my destruction, handed me over to a man threatening my home, for heated bathroom floors and a soaking tub from Milan. I didn't cry. Didn't argue. Didn't beg. I looked at the three of them and reclassified my own blood as hostile targets. I stepped back, gripped the door, and closed it in their faces. The lock clicked like a rifle bolt sliding home. I sat down at the kitchen table where Ethan's homework was spread under the lamp and helped him finish his long division. My hand didn't shake. Labor Day, the whole neighborhood gathered for the annual block barbecue. Walter had his rusted charcoal grill going. Daniel Brooks had folding tables covered in checkered cloths. Kids ran through a sprinkler. Grace Morgan strung paper lanterns between the oak trees. I stood near the grill with a paper plate, talking to Walter about his roses while Ethan played tag on the far end of the lawn. The atmosphere shattered the second the Sloan men came marching down the street, flanked by 4 of Grant's friends from the dojo, shoulder to shoulder, forcing Grace to step off the curb with her walker just to let them pass. Grant wore a compression shirt, fists already wrapped in tape. Richard walked behind him like a fight promoter, chest puffed, gold watch catching the light. Grant locked onto me from 30 yards out, shoved a neighborhood kid out of his path hard enough to drop the boy's hot dog in the grass. The music cut off. Every head turned. He stopped 5 feet in front of me and threw a pair of MMA gloves onto the ground. Put the gloves on, tough guy. You think your cheap trick made me trip was impressive. I challenge you right here, right now in front of everyone. Richard laughed from the back of the crowd, cheering his son on to beat a man in front of children on a holiday. 40 people froze, plates and cups in hand. The sprinkler hissed. The charcoal popped. Nobody moved. Ethan stood at the edge of the lawn, face white, knuckles pale, gripping the hem of his shirt, looking at me the way a kid looks at the only person who's ever made him feel safe. I realized with total clarity, if I backed down now, the fear Grant put in my son's eyes would never leave. He'd own this street forever. I set my plate down, wiped my hands, gave Ethan a slow nod and pulled off my jacket. Plain gray t-shirt, tactical boots, nothing else. Feet shoulder-width apart, arms relaxed, chin level. One rule, I said, holding his eyes. When you want to quit, stay flat on the ground. Grant laughed, bounced on his toes, threw shadow punches for the crowd, completely unaware he just stepped into the kill zone of a machine trained to end fights, not win them. If you've ever had your own blood betray you for money, hit like and drop your story in the comments. I drew my line in the grass and it was time to collect. Grant charged with a textbook 1-2, jab, then a heavy overhand right meant to take my head off. To anyone watching, it looked terrifying. 230 pounds moving fast. To me, it played out in slow motion. His jab telegraphed a full second early, his shoulder dipped, his guard dropped the instant he loaded the right. He'd already decided how this would end. He assumed I'd flinch the way every person in his life had. Instead, I stepped inside the arc of his hook. His fist tore through empty air 6 inches behind my head. Before he could retract, I pressed both palms into his tricep and chest, redirecting 230 pounds of momentum along a new path. Simple physics. He stumbled past me, nearly face-first into the asphalt, catching himself at the last second. Not a sound from the crowd. 40 people and nobody breathed. Grant spun, face dark red, chest heaving, and came again, faster, more desperate. A wild spinning roundhouse, the same one that won him his plastic trophy. Powerful. Also his fatal mistake, because the second his back turned, he lost sight of me completely. I stepped into his blind spot, hooked my heel behind his ankle, drove a palm strike into his shoulder blade. His own rotation, a locked ankle and forward pressure did the rest. Grant went airborne, hung parallel to the ground for one frozen second, then slammed into the packed earth hard enough that I felt it in my knees. Every ounce of air blew out of him in one grunt. His eyes went wide, mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out. Diaphragm locked. Before he could pull in a breath, I dropped my weight onto his torso, slid my forearm across the back of his neck, pinned him face down. Tap the ground, Grant, my mouth 3 inches from his ear. Show your daddy what a loser looks like. 5 seconds of desperate struggling. His face went from red to purple to a shade I'd only ever seen on men running out of oxygen at altitude. Then his trembling hand rose off the ground and tapped 3 times. I released, stood, brushed a blade of grass off my knee. 90 seconds total. Walter's burger had burned to a black disc on the grill. A kid was crying somewhere behind the sprinkler. Grant lay on his side, chest heaving, staring at the sky with the hollow look of a man whose entire identity had just been shredded in public. Richard shoved through the crowd, arms swinging. "You son of a," his voice cracked. I planted my feet, dropped my center 2 inches, locked my eyes on his chest. "Take one more step, Richard, and I will treat you as a direct threat." His rage froze mid-step, foot still in the air. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands. "I'll make you rot in prison, you psycho." 2 cruisers arrived within 7 minutes. Officer Miller and Officer Davis stepped out, scanning the crowd, lights washing across 40 silent faces. Richard grabbed Miller's sleeve, launching into a performance he'd clearly rehearsed during the wait. "Officers, this man is a discharged veteran with PTSD. He went insane and attacked my son without provocation." Before I could say a word, Daniel Brooks stepped out of the crowd. 72 years old, retired electrician, lived on this street longer than the trees. "That's a blatant lie." Grant challenged him and attacked first. He threw gloves at his feet and dared him to fight in front of the whole neighborhood. Everyone here saw it. Beside him, a 16-year-old named Jordan raised his phone, screen cracked but the footage crystal clear. Grant throwing the gloves. The shouted challenge word for word. Grant charging with fists raised. Officer Miller watched 12 seconds, jaw tightening, and handed the phone back. "If anyone's getting cuffed today, it's your son for assault. Take him home right now, or I arrest both of you for disturbing the peace and witness intimidation." Richard's mouth dropped open, cycling through shades of red, realizing his money couldn't rewrite what 40 people had just watched. He yanked Grant up by the good arm and dragged him toward the street. At the edge of the lawn, he turned back. "This isn't over, Damien. I'll find out where you work and destroy your military career. I have money and power you can't even imagine." I crossed my arms and watched him drag his broken son down the sidewalk like damaged luggage. I didn't flinch. I welcomed his final mistake. Richard was a man of his word. Within 72 hours, he hired a private investigator, a semi-retired ex-cop from Charlotte, cheap enough to take rush jobs and lazy enough not to ask questions. The PI ran my name through every database available, every public record, every social scrape, and hit a wall so fast it must have felt like sprinting into concrete in the dark. My file listed a GS7 administrative clerk in a basement office. No photo, no operational history, no unit designation. Everything above that required signatures from a congressional oversight committee. The PI billed Richard for 6 hours and told him exactly what he wanted to hear, that I was a nobody desk worker. But Richard held what he believed was a bigger card. Sloan Global Transport was bidding on a $40 million military transport contract, a federal procurement deal that would triple his revenue for a decade. He believed that kind of money bought influence, the same way it bought marble and palm trees. Using country club connections and a state senator who owed him a favor, Richard got a direct line to General William Pierce, Director of Federal Procurement for the Department of Defense. He called that Tuesday morning, introduced himself as a major defense contractor and a concerned citizen, described me as a violent, unstable veteran who'd assaulted his son, and demanded my immediate dishonorable discharge. Then he played his ace, threatening to pull his entire $40 million bid if the military didn't fire me on the spot. 10 minutes later, my encrypted government phone rang. That specific secure tone that only activates from inside the Pentagon's internal network. I was in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of coffee. "Damien, I just had a man named Richard order me to fire you." General Pierce's voice filled the receiver, deep and graveled, carrying the warmth of a man who'd just heard the funniest joke of his career. He let out a booming laugh. I leaned against the counter, smiling, waiting for the rest. "I let him exhaust all his arrogance first," the general continued, the laughter draining into cold precision. "Then I informed him you're the lead security assessor holding his company's bid file. His call constitutes a serious conflict of interest and personal vendetta violation." I closed my eyes. The $40 million bid was shredded. Not suspended. Shredded. Every clearance, every certification tied to Sloan Global Transport now carried a federal conflict of interest flag that would follow Richard's company through every procurement database for the next 20 years. No branch of the military would touch his name again. With one phone call fueled by pure ego, Richard Sloan had destroyed his own empire. I thanked the general, hung up, and took a slow sip of coffee. The kitchen was still. Ethan's backpack sat by the door, packed for the morning. The fallout hit fast. The video of Grant tapping out in 90 seconds spread across every neighborhood group chat within 48 hours. Someone posted it to a regional forum captioned, "Local MMA hero gets handled by a dad in combat boots." It wasn't just a loss, it was surgical public humiliation of a man who'd built his whole identity around being the most dangerous person in any room. Master Steele, the head instructor at Grant's dojo, replayed the footage frame by frame, then called an assembly. Every student lined up on the mat. Grant stood alone in front of 30 people who'd watched him strut for years. Master Steele stripped him of his black belt. 6 words. "You are banned from this dojo." Grant drove home in silence and locked himself in his room for 3 days. Sloan Global Transport entered a death spiral the same week. Losing the $40 million contract triggered a chain reaction his accountants had never modeled, because they'd never imagined a scenario where Richard's own mouth was the weapon that destroyed the company. 3 private equity partners and a regional bank had been promised that contract as the cornerstone of their growth projections. They pulled funding overnight. 2 of his biggest warehouse clients terminated leases within the month, citing reputational concerns. The bank holding his construction loan demanded full financial disclosure within 30 days. The whole empire, built on credit and inflated projections, cracked from the foundation up. Rebecca, my sister, who'd married Grant's family money and stood on my porch calling me jealous while her father-in-law threatened to destroy me, now found herself trapped inside a collapse she couldn't escape. The heated bathroom floors were still warm. The Italian marble still gleamed under the vanity lights. But the money paying for all of it was evaporating faster than she could spend it, and the man who'd promised her a life of luxury was now spending his nights on the phone with bankruptcy attorneys. 2 months later, a plain white moving truck idled in the Sloan driveway. No logo, they hadn't even hired a branded company. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, watching them load what was left. Richard carried a floor lamp with a crooked shade. Rebecca carried a garment bag and a box of kitchen utensils, sunglasses pushed up on her head under an overcast sky. She didn't look at me. Grant sat in the truck cab, hood up, face turned to the dashboard, shoulders hunched like a man trying to disappear inside himself. Nobody looked at the neighbors. Walter stood at his mailbox with coffee. Daniel sat on his porch steps, hands folded. Grace stood at the end of her driveway with her walker still and silent. Jordan sat on his steps, elbows on his knees. Nobody waved. The whole street stood in quiet collective witness as the family that terrorized their block finally packed up their arrogance and drove away. Daniel raised his coffee mug toward me. Just a small lift of the wrist. A nod. I didn't gloat. Didn't wave. The truck turned the corner, the engine fading until all that was left was the rustle of leaves and a mockingbird calling from the oak in my front yard. I smiled, turned around, and walked back inside to where Ethan was working through his math homework under the desk lamp, chewing his pencil eraser, frowning at a fraction problem, bare feet swinging above the floor. I pulled the notebook toward me and showed him how to find the common denominator. The pencil scratched softly against the paper. The kitchen was still. The fence outside stood exactly where I'd built it, undamaged, marking the quiet border of a life that finally belonged entirely to us. Sometimes justice isn't decided in a courtroom. It's decided by the choices we make. This was cold verdict. Because every story has a verdict.